The nail split clean across the knuckle as she drove it into the frozen beam, blood seeping down her thumb and vanishing into the frayed cuff of her sleeve. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't even glance down. The cold had numbed her fingers hours ago. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee caught in a pine snare, tearing across the hills with the sharpness of splintered glass. But inside her cabin, her first cabin, there was nothing but stillness, a kind of quiet that made your bones feel hollow, empty, because heat didn't live here anymore. It had fled the moment the frost took the walls, crept through the floorboards, wrapped its fists around the stovepipe, and bled the last of the warmth right up into the night sky. Now, Sarah's 3 children were huddled under every quilt and shawl they owned, curled into one another like scared animals. They didn't even cry anymore, just shivered, teeth clacking in their sleep, a sound she could hear even now behind the blanket she'd hung across the bedroom opening. To keep what little heat there was in this corner of the house, she pounded in another nail. The log pressed against the wall gave a groan, settling into place. It wasn't shaped right, not perfectly squared like the ones that made up the rest of the home. This one had bark still frozen to one side. She didn't care. Her second cabin, her new cabin, wasn't going to be pretty. It was going to be warm, or at least warmer, because she didn't build it outside. She was building it inside the house, right in the center of what used to be her living room, the same living room where her late husband once strummed his old banjo by the fire, where guests used to laugh and sip winter cider, where her daughter had taken her first steps, wobbling between the chairs now pushed to the side and draped in frost-stiffened linen. This place was a shell now, so she was building a smaller shell inside it, a second cabin, something they could actually survive in, something tight, insulated, thick, sealed, and everyone had laughed, even before the blizzard came down from the mountains and turned the whole valley into a white graveyard. They'd called her crazy, said she was wasting her time, said she was grieving wrong, that no woman, alone with 3 children and a dead husband not yet a year in the ground, should be cutting fresh logs in December, that she'd gone soft in the head. Building a cabin inside a cabin, one man had said at the store, tipping back his hat to show a scar that had turned silver in the cold. Why don't you just set your money on fire? Be warmer that way. But she hadn't been building for comfort, not at first. She'd been building because her children were dying in their sleep. It started with the baby, little Joel. He'd woken one morning with lips blue and skin waxy. He hadn't cried when she picked him up, just stared through her, chest barely rising. It had taken the whole day to bring him back, cradling him against the fire until her own skin blistered. The logs burned fast in this kind of cold. You could feed the stove constantly and still find ice on the windows. Her breath froze on her apron while she washed him. The washwater froze in the bowl before she finished scrubbing. She needed a new plan, so she'd gone out and started cutting logs. The pile had been buried in snow, green wood she and Matthew had never had time to stack properly. But she found enough straight pieces, hauled them inside, let them thaw in front of the fire for days, then started building, right there, on the hardwood floor they'd scrubbed raw every spring. She laid a foundation of crossbeams, bolted it to the floor, and began raising walls. No insulation yet, just pure thickness, 4 layers deep, each corner pinned tight with dowels she'd carved by hand. The walls had to be thick enough to trap breath, to trap body heat, to trap life. She hung blankets over the top for now, but planned to make a roof too, a sloped one, with a vent for the little tin stove she hadn't used since '83, when they tried camping out by the creek and it had smoked them near to death. That stove was inside now too, sitting like a scolded child in the corner, waiting to be useful. She heard a cough behind her, turned slowly. It was her daughter Ruth, 8 years old, pale as a ghost and thinner than ever. The child held her arms around herself like a shawl. "Mama," she whispered. "I'm cold." Sarah dropped the hammer. She didn't say anything, just crossed the room, picked the girl up, and carried her toward the half-built box in the center of the living room. Inside, she'd laid down every quilt she could spare, folded jackets into a mattress. It wasn't ready yet, the roof wasn't on, but it was already warmer than the rest of the house, just by the trapping of their own breath. She tucked Ruth in, kissed her head, whispered something, then went back to work. She couldn't afford to stop, couldn't wait for approval, couldn't ask permission from the men who laughed, couldn't listen to the neighbor who stopped by and said, "Sarah, you're filling your house with logs like a beaver. That ain't shelter. That's madness." Maybe it was, but it was her madness, and it was 22 degrees warmer inside that wooden box than the rest of the cabin. She'd measured it herself, breath steaming on the cracked thermometer her husband left in the toolbox. By the time she finished the roof, the wind had turned brutal. No snow fell anymore, just ice, air that sliced through canvas like claws. The old stove choked and wheezed, and finally died. She poured out the last kerosene trying to relight it. The main cabin grew colder than the outside. The thermometer needle cradle dropped below the marks, below freezing, below hope, and yet inside the second cabin, tucked into the living room like a secret, her children slept, all three of them. No frost on their breath, no shivers, just soft, slow breathing, the kind she hadn't heard in weeks. And that was when it hit her, what she'd really done. She hadn't just built a cabin, she'd built a womb, a new place for them to be born again, a second chance, a sealed-off world that defied the world outside. And it worked. But that was also when the real trouble began, because the neighbors had seen the smoke, and not everyone in the valley had survived the first night of the big freeze. Not everyone had wood left, not everyone had a plan, and not everyone was going to knock before they came calling. The knock didn't come. That was the part that stayed in Sarah's memory longest afterward. There was no knock, no call from the porch, no stomp of boots to shake off snow, just the door, just the soft creak of it being eased open like a thief slipping a coin from your coat while your back was turned. Her eyes were on the new stove at the time, trying to thread one of the salvaged iron bolts through a hinge on the stovepipe lid. Her fingers had warmed enough to sting now that the smaller cabin was sealed, and she was cursing quietly because the threads wouldn't catch, and then came the cold draft on her neck and a voice behind her. "Place smells like meat." She turned so fast, her heels skidded across the floor, the bolt clattered somewhere under the stove, and she found herself staring at a man, not someone she knew, thin, grey, too clean-shaven for this kind of weather, a slick-skinned sort of man with a heavy coat too fine for any honest farmer. His eyes moved like a weasel's, darting, calculating. Behind him the door stood wide open, and behind the door were two more figures. One she recognized, Ezra Kell, a neighbor from the other side of the ridge who'd borrowed a length of rope from Matthew last spring and never brought it back. The other was a boy, couldn't have been more than 12, stood like a fence post, arms stiff to his side, face red and wind-burned. His ears looked frostbitten. Sarah's voice was quiet, measured, but her hand crept toward the poker by the hearth. "I didn't say you could come in." Weasel Eyes smiled like a fox that knew the coop was already open. "Didn't hear you say we couldn't. Saw your smoke. Figured somebody was alive in here. That's rare these days." Ezra stepped in then, brushed snow off his sleeves like it was just a friendly visit. "Sarah," he said, with the kind of voice a man uses when trying not to sound desperate. "We ain't here for trouble." That usually meant they were. She didn't move from the stove. "Then what are you here for?" Ezra took his hat off, held it like a boy at a funeral. "It's bad out there," he said, glancing at the walls of the second cabin rising in the center of her living room. "Real bad. Town's near frozen over. Doc Gordon didn't make it past Tuesday. We found him stiff in his chair, whole place locked from the inside. Smoke never started." "Again?" Weasel Eyes sniffed the air. "You got heat, wood, some kind of second place inside the house, like a box inside a box. Never seen that before." "It's a cabin," Sarah said, voice hardening. "Inside another cabin. Now that you've seen it, you can leave." Ezra didn't step forward, but he didn't leave either. "We lost our stove night before last," he said quietly. "Pipes cracked. Whole cabin smoked out. We tried to patch it. Didn't work. We're running out of options, Sarah." Weasel Eyes gave a low whistle. "That thing you got there must be what, 60, 70 degrees warmer inside it? You're not freezing at all." That was when she realized something that turned her stomach to stone. They weren't just passing through. They'd known what they were looking for when they stepped onto her porch. Ezra spoke again, carefully. "We ain't asking to stay, just to warm up, just for a night or two. The boy—" He nodded toward the frozen-looking child behind him. "That's my nephew. His folks passed on the road. He's just a kid. Needs some place not to die." Sarah stared at the boy, at his hands, which were purple at the fingertips. She didn't want to feel pity. Pity had a way of killing mothers faster than frost. But she saw her own son in that boy's size. The same narrow shoulders, the same silence, and something shifted in her chest. She stepped back. "Only the boy," she said. "He can stay by the fire for a few hours, no more." Ezra looked like he might protest, but Weasel Eyes stepped in before he could. "Fine," the man said. "Fine by me. Boy, go on." The child stumbled in without a word, his boots leaving little trails of snow across the floor. Sarah pointed to a blanket near the fire. The boy dropped there like a dying bird, face pressed into the warmth, and didn't move again. Weasel Eyes and Ezra stepped back toward the door, but the man's voice trailed behind like oil. "Strange thing, building a second cabin. Dangerous too. You know heat like that attracts folks. Might not always be neighbors." He left before she could reply, and for the next 3 days, she barely slept. The boy stayed, said nothing, ate little, but he warmed up, hands regained color. He helped chop some sticks for kindling once, and when she asked his name, he just said, "Ben," nothing else. But the air outside kept getting colder, and soon more people started showing up. Not neighbors exactly. Some she didn't recognize. A woman with 3 children, a man with a stump where his hand had been, a pair of old brothers who'd been living in a dugout west of the creek, said the snow had buried them alive and they'd only just tunneled out. All of them heard about her heat. Some came polite. Some just sat near her fence, hunched like scarecrows, hoping she'd take pity. She didn't have enough to give. The logs were running low. The inner stove burned fast, even with the tighter space. She'd built a miracle, yes, but it needed constant feeding, and the cold outside now felt unnatural, like it wanted to seep through her bones, like it knew she'd cheated it once and had come back angrier. She let the woman and her children inside, couldn't help herself, but when she closed the door that night and turned the bolt tight, she knew she'd have to do more than patch the walls and tend the fire. She'd have to protect what she built, so she began turning the outer cabin into a shell of defense, barricading windows, stacking crates against the doors, reinforcing her shutters with slats from the woodpile she'd once kept aside for planting stakes in spring. She shoved all the furniture up against the front door at night. The second cabin, the one inside, became their bunker. She moved everything essential inside: food, lamp, matches, dry clothes. They all slept there now, tightly packed, breathing each other's air, a family plus 4 strangers, curled together like foxes in a hollow tree. And that's when the howling started. Not the wind, this was something else. First at night, long, low sounds that echoed across the snow like morning calls. Not wolves, not coyotes, human, a woman maybe, or something that had once been one. Wailing, then silence. Sarah sat bolt upright in the inner cabin, rifle across her lap. Her eldest, Sam, clutched her hand. The others were dead asleep or faking it. Then a pounding at the outer walls, a scream, then running footsteps. By the time she unlatched the peephole she'd carved through the living room shutter, the yard was empty, just churned up snow and a smell of smoke on the air. It happened again 2 nights later, and again, louder, someone throwing rocks. One cracked her window, and each time, they never stayed. They just tested her. The cold wasn't going to kill her, but people might. Weasel Eyes came back on the 5th night, not alone this time. 3 more with him, all strangers. One had a burn across his cheek, another held a shovel like a weapon. "Sarah," he said from the porch, "let's not make this harder." She stood behind the door, voice steady. "You come through that door," she said. "You'll find out just how hard I can make it." A pause, then laughter. "You're going to shoot us? With what wood left? What food? You've got 4 others inside now, don't you? Maybe more. You think they'll all die for you? They don't have to." "Then open the door." Sarah took a slow breath. No. Silence. Then footsteps. And then the porch cracked, under weight. A body. No. Something heavy. A log? A battering ram? She didn't wait. She fired through the door. The shot blew splinters into the wind, echoed through the valley, and was followed by chaos. A scream, cursing, running, then silence again. Her children didn't cry. They just waited. And when dawn came, she opened the door slow and found nothing but blood on the porch. Dropped axe, and a scrap of coat caught on the fence. Winter wasn't done, but neither was she. She buried the axe behind the barn before anyone could come looking for it. The blade was chipped, one side dented where it had struck something hard. Maybe the frame of her door, maybe a beam. Blood had crusted up around the handle. It wasn't Ezra's, that much she was sure of. The coat scrap caught on her fence had belonged to someone taller, with a broader chest. One of the others who came with that weasel-faced man. Whoever it was, he hadn't come back for the axe. And if he was still breathing, she figured he wouldn't be for long. The snow took the wounded faster than it did the healthy. She said nothing to the others when she came back in, not to the boy still curled up on the blanket by the stove, or the woman with 3 children sleeping on the floor of the inner cabin, not even to her own son, who looked at her with eyes that weren't 12 anymore, but something older, something that had already begun to understand what it meant to fight for a family that still had breath. Sarah sat by the fire and fed it carefully, each stick chosen from what remained of the second woodpile she'd dragged in the week before. The inside of the house smelled of smoke and people, sweat, damp wool, iron. The smell of cold people warmed too fast. That smell that hit your nose like old bread when wet coats steamed dry too quickly. She didn't mind it anymore. It meant they were still warm, still alive. She kept the fire low that night, afraid the smoke would draw more eyes. She nailed heavy canvas over the shattered front window, then over the other 2 as well. Darkness swept the cabin before evening fell, but no one complained. Light made you visible, heat made you desirable, and in the wild, cruel economy of the freeze that made you a target. The inner cabin, though, it still held warmth like a heartbeat. The walls she'd built with her own hands, though crude, were tight now, packed with spare rags between the gaps. The tin stove inside had been patched with strips of tin she'd pulled off an old washtub, and the stovepipe rose clean through the roof into a clay-chinked sleeve that vented into the original chimney above. It wasn't safe by town standards, but town was dead, and safety was what you made with what you had. The woman, name was Delia, whispered that night, once the children were asleep, asking if she thought they'd come back. Sarah didn't lie. They will, she said, sooner, stronger. Delia's face hardened. Her fingers ran through her daughter's hair, as if memorizing it. What are we going to do when they do? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she rose, lifted a crate from the corner, and opened it to reveal a single rifle, 6 cartridges, a hammer, and a box of bent nails. Not much, but better than nothing. Build tighter, she said, and not just with wood. That night she worked by the faint light of the stove. No lanterns, no candles, just the glow of fire and the rhythm of resolve. She drilled holes in the walls between the outer cabin and the new one, tiny slits, big enough for a rifle barrel, small enough to stay hidden. She arranged pans, pots, iron tools in patterns against the walls, makeshift noisemakers that would rattle if anyone touched them. She tied tin spoons to the door latches. She packed snow into crates and stacked them by the back window. When they froze solid, they'd be harder than stone. Sam helped, quietly, without being asked. He handed her the twine, the nails, held things when she needed 2 hands. His face had changed since the first freeze, thinner, sharper, but steadier too. There was something in his posture now that hadn't been there before. She watched him hammer a slat onto the window frame and thought how strange it was that the storm had turned him into someone his father would have nodded at in pride or grief. By the time morning came, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a stronghold, a desperate one, but a stronghold nonetheless. And they needed every bit of it, because the next visitors didn't knock. They came just before dawn, 6 of them. She saw them first from the attic slot she'd carved into the eaves, crouched on her belly with a wool blanket over her head to keep her breath from fogging the air. The moon was faint, but snow reflected it enough to see outlines. Shadows. One of them had a lantern, which they covered carefully. Another carried what looked like a crowbar. 2 had rifles slung. They circled the house like wolves. No words, just glances, testing doors, pressing on shutters, listening. She waited until they were all near the porch before she moved. She didn't fire. Not yet. Instead, she took the firewood crate from beside the inner cabin, dragged it to the door, and shoved it open so hard the hinges cracked. The cold rushed in like a living thing, biting her throat. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, deliberately, to show no fear. The rifle was slung across her chest. She didn't raise it. "Walk," she said, her voice cut through the dark like a whip. "Now." The men froze. One of them, a tall shape with a lantern, stepped forward. "We just want to talk." "No," she said. "You want to take. Everyone that comes here wants to take. I built this. Every log, every fire, every warm breath in this place. You didn't help. You didn't care. Now you come crawling like crows to a fresh carcass. You can't hold out forever," he said, but there was unease in it. "Watch me." A long pause, then another voice, soft, too soft. "We've got kids too." Sarah blinked. Her hands didn't lower, but her heart did. Just slightly. That was when she saw the shape behind them, a woman holding a bundle. It moved, coughed. She closed her eyes for half a second. "2 of you," she said. "Only 2. 1 adult, 1 child. That's all. I can fit." "What?" the man barked. You want to argue with the woman holding the only fire in the valley?" She snapped. "Take it or go." There was tension then, shuffling, whispering, a sharp word between 2 of the men. One raised a hand to another's chest, as if to stop him from stepping forward. Sarah kept the rifle up, 1 foot still inside the threshold. Finally, 2 shapes separated from the rest, the woman and her child. The others stepped back, watched. Sarah let them in. They stayed in the outer cabin, not the inner one. Sarah made that clear. She gave them 2 blankets and a crate to sit on. She boiled a small pot of beans and shared half. It was more than she should have, but something in her couldn't help it. The next morning, the men were gone. No footprints trailed away, just wind-swept drifts. That unsettled her more than their arrival. She set new traps, dug a trench outside the back wall, and lined it with snow and ash. Anything stepped there would leave dark prints. She showed Sam how to check it, Delia too. Taught the older children how to stay silent when they heard voices. Taught them how to warm stones by the fire and tuck them in bedding. How to stack snow against the outer walls to keep heat in, not just keep the cold out. Little tricks, the kind you didn't learn until you needed them. The cabin inside the cabin began to feel less like a trick and more like a new kind of home. They called it the box now. "Back in the box," Sarah would say at dusk. "No fire until the box is sealed. Keep your breath in the box. Box saves us. Don't let heat leave the box. It became a rhythm, and it worked. She took measurements each night, 71 degrees warmer inside the box than outside. Her children were red-cheeked again. They laughed. Once, she wept when they did. It felt like a betrayal. To laugh, to feel light when so many around them were dead or dying. But she didn't stop them. She just watched and knew it wouldn't last. Not in that valley, not with word spreading. On the 12th night of the freeze, firelight appeared on the ridge. She saw it from the attic slot again. 4 separate fires, all small, all scattered. Not a camp, not travelers. Watch fires, signals. They were marking her. That night, she stayed dressed, slept with the rifle beside her and her boots on. And before the morning came, someone tried to burn her barn. Only half of it caught. They'd poured oil on the south wall and lit it in the dark, probably thinking the wind would carry the flames to the house. But the wind changed just in time. She and Sam ran out and killed the flames with snow and wet burlap. There were footprints, boots, 3 sets. She followed them as far as the tree line. Didn't see anyone. But she left a message in the snow all the same, used her boot heel to carve one word into the white. No, nothing more. Let them wonder if it was threat or warning or just the resolve of a woman who refused to die. But they didn't come back the next night, or the one after, and slowly silence returned. Sarah didn't trust it. She doubled her guard, moved the supplies into the box, let the outer cabin freeze again. It became the shell it was always meant to be, her first home, now just bones around the fire, an exoskeleton. But her people stayed warm, laughed again, lived, and outside, the world kept dying. The storm broke on the 22nd night, not with snow, but silence. That morning, the wind didn't howl, the trees didn't creak, the cabin sat in a dome of muffled air, still as a tomb. And when Sarah stepped out to check the chimney pipe, the sound of her boots on the porch boards echoed like hammer strikes. The sky above was blank, drained of color, and the snow no longer drifted sideways, but piled thick and wet on the rooftops, heavy enough to collapse fences. The forest beyond looked like a photograph caught between breaths. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something worse than cold. Stillness. Too much of it. No birds, no wolves, no sign of motion at all except the soft, endless descent of snow. She watched the ridge for movement, for firelight, for the shimmer of lanterns that had marked the watchers before. But there was nothing. Just white hills, quiet trees, a single fox track curling off into the ravine like a question. When she returned to the cabin, her cheeks tingled, not from cold, but from the sudden contrast of stepping into warmth, into life. It shocked her every time. She looked around. The box, their second cabin, now fully lined with extra wool and a layered ceiling of scrap wood, was holding heat better than ever. With only a few sticks burned every 2 hours, they could keep the inner space above 60 degrees. Her breath no longer fogged when she leaned over her children. Ruth no longer shivered in her sleep. Sam had even started sleeping without gloves. It was a miracle. But miracles don't last long in the frontier. That same day, something changed. Sarah heard it in the way the child, Ben, the boy Ezra had left behind, coughed. It was dry, short, not frostbitten, not cold breath. It was warm lunged, sick lunged. She watched him for an hour before speaking. Delia noticed too. Both women said nothing until night, when the children were asleep and the cabin dim with stove light. "He's burning," Delia whispered. Sarah nodded. She'd already laid a palm on his forehead. It was damp, too damp. "I'll make onion poultice," she said. "We're out of onions." Sarah stood still a moment. There were other ways, old ways, but they'd run out of medicine 2 weeks ago. Ben was sick, and worse, they were sealed in close quarters. A second cabin within the first. A miracle for warmth, but a coffin for contagion. She stood that night and opened the roof vent wide, let cold air pour in. Delia gasped. "What are you doing?" "Letting the heat escape," Sarah said. "But if he's sick and we're breathing it, we all go down. I'd rather sleep in our coats again than lose everyone in one breath." Delia said nothing, but her hands tightened on her child. That night they slept cold again, not freezing, but back to the edge. Sarah refused to light the stove again until dawn. She packed the blankets tighter, spread the children further apart, whispered old prayers, not because she believed, but because the rhythm helped. Ben's coughing got worse. Sarah couldn't ask him to leave. He was just a boy, but she made a hard decision. She would separate the box into 2, use old tarps, split it down the middle, put Ben and the other sick ones, if any emerged, on one side. Use a second vent, burn slower fires, less risk. It would ruin the warmth ratio, but it might save their lives. They built it the next day. Ben was too weak to protest. Sam helped again, not speaking. He knew, the others knew too. The miracle was breaking. The cracks were showing. And still, the silence outside grew heavier. No new visitors, no footsteps, no sign of Ezra. of weasel eyes, of the men with rifles, not even signs of struggle in the woods. It was as if the freeze had swallowed them whole. On the 24th day, the sun returned, but pale, grey through the trees. The wind didn't howl anymore. The cold wasn't cruel, it was final, like a lid closing over a grave. That night, Sarah heard voices again, low, from the forest. She climbed into the attic crawl space, watched from the vent. 3 figures, walking slow, none with lanterns. One leaned on the other. They passed the cabin, didn't stop, didn't even look. They walked into the valley below and vanished behind the rocks. She never saw them again. Sarah stayed up the rest of the night, watching the trees, but no one else came. In the morning, the cabin walls glistened, melt. The temperature outside had shifted, only by a few degrees, but enough. The storm was ending. She didn't say it aloud, didn't dare curse it, but when she stepped onto the porch and saw drips forming along the eaves, she felt it deep in her chest. The thaw had begun. She went back inside and found Sam awake, already tying his boots. "I want to check the creek," he said. She didn't stop him. They needed to know. They needed water, fish, signs of animal life, signs of anything. He left with the rifle slung, a skin of warm water and a whistle tied to his neck. She waited, an hour, 2, then a scream, sharp, short, cut off. Sarah grabbed her boots, ran. The snow had crusted overnight. Her boots barely broke the top. She moved fast, faster than she had in days, breath bursting from her in ragged clouds. She followed the trail to the creek, eyes darting for red, for broken shapes, for signs of ambush, and then she saw him, standing, shaking, covered in snow, but alive. He pointed. She followed his hand. There, half submerged in the ice, a wagon. Broken, charred, bodies inside, 4 of them, frozen, curled like sleeping dogs, one with a shawl over her face, one still clutching a rifle. They had tried to reach her, didn't make it. She knelt by the wreckage, pulled the shawl back. It was Ezra, his lips blue, face peaceful, no sign of struggle, just stillness. Sam said nothing. They gathered what supplies they could from the wreck, a sack of flour, 2 cans, a pair of boots that would fit Ruth, a tin box with something rattling, matches. Back home, they burned the matches just to test them, all lit. Sarah stored them in a jar by the stove. Ben's fever broke that night. His sweat turned clear, his breath easier. Delia wept and wouldn't stop. Sarah sat on the floor, hands in her lap, and watched the stove flicker low. Then she looked around the box, the second cabin, the one that had held their heat, their hope. It had saved them, but now it was time to take it apart. Not all of it, but slowly. She pulled one plank free, then another, not because they were giving up, but because spring was coming, and the world outside would soon need to be rebuilt. The first birdsong came 5 days later, faint, high-pitched and uncertain, as if the sparrow itself didn't trust the sound of its own voice. Sarah was mending a split seam in Ruth's mitten when she heard it. She stopped mid-stitch, needle frozen between her fingers, and tilted her head toward the sealed window. Another chirp, then 2, short bursts, question marks in the silence. The girl beside her looked up, blinking. Sam appeared from the inner room, his face rigid with cautious hope. They all held still. Then it came again. Not wind, not whistle, not scream, birdsong. And that was the day she knew they'd made it. Not just through a storm, not just through hunger, but through something worse. The kind of cold that didn't just bite at the skin, but slithered into a family's soul and tried to freeze its way through the cracks in your faith. The kind that made neighbors turn on each other, made people forget their own names for a bite of warmth. The kind that made a widow build a second home inside the grave of her first one, nail by nail, like a woman clawing her way back from death one board at a time. It was over, not entirely, not yet, but the edge had broken. They'd endured, and now came the price of surviving. Ben's cough faded by the end of the week. He could sit up without trembling, eat full portions without retching. His color returned slowly, pink patches across the cheeks, lips no longer purple. But his voice stayed thin, and his eyes had that distant glaze Sarah had seen in veterans after the war. Boys who'd gone off in wool uniforms and come back as ghosts wearing skin. She caught him staring at the walls sometimes, not at anything, just through. He never once asked about Ezra. She never told him. Sam knew. Delia knew. They all did, in their own way. The knowledge sat in the box like a second. Fire, cold, not warm, a presence that filled the small space where heat once danced alone. She began pacing the outer rooms more often, looking at windows like they were doorways. She talked about spring like it was a distant cousin coming to visit, someone you remembered fondly but had forgotten how to speak to. "I want to go back to my place," she said one morning, stirring cornmeal over the rekindled kitchen fire. "Back across the ridge. I want to see if the walls are still there." Sarah didn't stop her, just packed her a sack of dry beans, a tin of lard, and a small cloth bundle of matches. Delia hugged her without words. Her children said thank you. Ruth cried when they left. Ben stayed. Didn't say why, just didn't leave. He took to chopping wood again, slowly at first, then with more strength each day. Sam showed him where to find dry branches in the thaw. They began stacking a new pile behind the barn. It felt different now. Not survival, but preparation for something beyond tomorrow. When Sarah finally removed the last wall of the box, the room felt bigger than she remembered. She stood in the middle, arms limp, and looked around at the old home she'd known. The original cabin, her husband's cabin, the one they'd built when they first came west with their hopes tucked into a wagon and no map to speak of. Now here it stood again, hollow, quiet, but breathing. She could hear the floor creak under her again, like a voice returning after a long illness. The hearth crackled. The wind no longer banged at the shutters. It passed through the cracks in the siding like an apology. And that's when they came. The riders, 4 of them, on weak horses, ribs showing, bridles wrapped in old rope. They didn't gallop, just walked, cautious, watching. Sarah saw them from the woodshed. She didn't run for the rifle, not this time. She stood still, waiting, hands empty. The riders stopped at her gate. The lead one dismounted. A woman, tall, wrapped in a union coat bleached nearly white with wear, hair braided under her collar, eyes dark with exhaustion. "You're the one with the inside cabin," she said. Sarah nodded once. "Word spread," the woman said. "Half the valley died. Most of the rest fled. Those of us left are trying to find each other." Sarah didn't speak. The woman swallowed, looked down. "We're not asking to stay," she said, "just to know how. What you did, so maybe the next storm doesn't take us to." Sarah exhaled through her nose, looked back at the house, then turned toward the woodpile, gestured. The woman followed. They stood there an hour. Sarah showed them where the second stove had sat, pointed out the vent, the way she'd packed the walls, how she'd layered the blankets, the insulation tricks, the way she'd used the outer cabin like a shell, told them about sealing off a space tight enough to warm with only breath and blankets, just enough dry wood to cook and keep fingers from freezing. One of the riders, young man, maybe 17, jotted notes in a small pad. Another woman wept when Sarah showed her how to make heat stones for the bedding. When they left, the tall woman turned in the saddle. "You saved more than your own," she said. Sarah didn't answer, didn't need to. The snow had stopped falling a week ago, but now the thaw began for everyone else. By spring, 7 more families had returned to the valley. Some rebuilt, some didn't. Some buried loved ones and left. Some never came back at all. Sarah stayed. She replanted the garden, fixed the barn roof, taught Sam to read blueprints so they could reinforce the original cabin walls properly this time, showed Ruth how to layer pine needles beneath the beds, helped Ben hang shelves on the newly exposed living room wall where the second cabin had stood, nails still bent where the box had been built in desperation. The heat came back slowly, but it came, and by the time the spring flood soaked the lower fields, and green buds pushed up through the frost-softened ground, Sarah sat on the porch in her rocking chair again, hands in her lap, and listened, not for footsteps, not for the wind, but for laughter. It came from inside. Children, alive, they laughed, they survived. And no one ever laughed again at the woman who built a cabin inside her living room. Not after it kept her family 67 degrees warmer, not after it kept them alive,